Here on the BreakPoint Podcast, we try to do a lot more than just repeat the news. We try to bring in a distinctly Christian set of observations and takeaways, ways that our audience can take captive thoughts that otherwise might lead to fear and even hopelessness. Right now, our nation and the world are struggling to figure out how to respond to the coronavirus while preserving as many lives as possible. We have a chance as the church, I think, to look at history now and see how Christians in times past have responded in the midst of plagues and pandemics that have been much worse than the one we're currently facing. Joining me today to talk about this is Dr. Glen Sunshine, professor of history at Central Connecticut State University, formerly at Calvin College. He's an active scholar and author of numerous books, including Why You Think the Way You Do, The Story of Western Worldview from Rome to Home, and Portals, Entering Your Neighbor's World. For a while now, he's taught courses on the Black Death specifically, as well as the Crusades and early modern European history. Dr. Sunshine, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks, Shane.
Well, Christianity has been around now for 2,000 years. It's been the main religious influence on the West for most of that time. And the church has seen wars, empires rise and fall, natural disasters, and all kinds of things like that. But one thing that stands out in church history are the plagues and diseases that hit Europe especially. Glenn, give us an overview of the time period and scale of these events. What did it look like?
Well, the early church faced three major plagues. The 2nd century, the plague of Galen, the 3rd century, Cyprian's plague, and then in the 6th century, Justinian's plague. Then later, of course, the really big one is the Black Death in the 14th century. And in each of these, what you find is that the church responded in ways that are difficult really for people who don't share our worldview, don't share our attitude toward loving service, don't share our attitude toward the afterlife. It's difficult for them to really grasp what it was that the church was doing. The first plague, Galen's plague in the 2nd century, this was so bad that, well, Galen himself, who was the premier physician of the Roman Empire, the first thing he did when the plague broke out is he left town and went to his country estate to weather it out there because he knew there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. And there were literally bodies piled in the streets. Cyprian's plague was even worse in a lot of ways. What we have on the accounts of that are so many people were dying and people were so absolutely terrified of this that they would take sick people and basically throw them out onto the street to leave them to die because they were so terrified of the contagion of the plague. When you get to Justinian's plague, this really, in a lot of ways, stopped the comeback of the Roman Empire in its tracks. And not only did it hit, regions like Constantinople, where we have the best records of it, but it goes all the way to Ireland. The great Irish saints of the 2nd generation in the 6th century, almost all of them die of plague. So these are devastating things. And yet they pale compared to the Black Death in the 14th century, which killed, by our best numbers now, the best estimates we have right now, is it killed something like 48% of the population of Europe in 3 years. So that's the scope of what we're dealing with historically. And again, in every one of these instances, what we see are Christians doing things that, on the level of just looking at things from this world's perspective, make no sense at all.
And it's hard, Glenn, for us to step back into that time period, post-germ theory, post-modern medicine, and really put ourselves in those circumstances to see these things the way those suffering from them at that time did. Plagues were uniquely terrifying, not just because of how deadly they were, but because of how mysterious they were, right? I mean, nobody knew what caused this. They had a vague sense of contagion and that you want to distance yourself from the sick and dying, and that was part of the motivation for abandoning them and throwing them in the streets. But this was uniquely terrifying. It was a scourge they couldn't control. Do you think there's a big difference between the way we look at a plague today, like coronavirus, and the way those who faced ancient plagues did?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of differences there, not the least of which is we have a degree of faith in science and in our medicine that they really didn't have in that period. Like I said, Galen, the major medical theorist of the Roman world, fled as soon as the plague hit because, again, they knew that there was nothing that they could do to stop this thing. We at least have the sense that, yeah, we got some idea of what's causing this. We can work on vaccines. We can work on treatment, all of these kinds of things. We've got a much better sense of that. And we have a great deal more faith in our technology, our medicine, and our science than they did in the ancient world. But it's also worth noting that even with this increased faith, we're still seeing high levels of panic. We're still seeing people, not really knowing what to do about this, not really sure, whether it's safe to go outside. We've got runs on toilet paper, which have absolutely nothing to do with this. I mean, the reactions have been really crazy in a lot of ways. But that just shows that the degree of faith we have in our medical systems, in our government, and in our ability to deal with this isn't quite what we might hope or expect. It's certainly much better than it was in the ancient world. But even now, we're seeing this level of panic and uncertainty sinking in.
Before we talk about the Christian response to plagues throughout history, I want to give our listeners a sense of the Greco-Roman attitude toward plagues. And this was a passage I stumbled upon from. It has to do with the Cyprian plague, and it was written by Pontius of Carthage in the 250s thereabout, at a time when about 5,000 people a day were dying in Rome from this plague. Could have been smallpox, could have been a number of different candidates. Historians aren't sure what it was. But he writes, "Afterwards there broke out a dreadful plague, an excessive destruction of a hateful disease invaded every house in succession of the trembling populace, carrying off day by day with abrupt attack numberless people, everyone from his own house. All were shuddering, fleeing, shunning the contagion, impiously exposing their own friends, as if with the exclusion of the person who was sure to die of the plague, one could exclude death itself also. There lay about the meanwhile over the city no longer bodies, but the carcasses of many, and by the contemplation of a lot which in their turn would be theirs, demanded the pity of the passers-by for themselves. No one regarded anything besides his cruel gains. No one trembled at the remembrance of a similar event. No one did to another what he himself wished to experience." And I love the reversal there at the end of Christ's commandment to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's almost like he has it in mind. Is that a fair assessment? Is that possible?
I think it is very possible. One of the things to remember is that the Golden Rule isn't unique to Christianity. I don't know whether he knew it from Jesus or from a Roman ethicist, but it seems almost certain that that is echoing or inverting the Golden Rule.
So that's the
there.
Roman response in the midst of this terrifying plague. Tell us about the Christian response. How is it different?
Well, just one quick note. I think the Cyprian plague was more likely not to be smallpox, but to be something more like Ebola, something along those lines. When you look at the descriptions, just sort of interesting to try to pin these things down. But what the Christians did, all right, let's look at the Galen's plague, 2nd century. Galen commented that the Christians went out and treated the sick. When everybody else was running away, the Christians would go out and work with the sick. They'd go out, they'd visit them, comfort the dying, all of these kinds of things, and work to relieve their sufferings. Galen's comment is that the Christians acted with complete disregard for their own lives because they believed that if they died, they just went someplace better. And the fact of the matter is everybody's going to die of something. Therefore, you die of plague, you die of something else. It doesn't really matter. We've got a better life waiting for us. It's an expanded version of the comment that Galen made. You see a similar comment about Cyprian's plague made by, I believe his name was Dionysius. He was a bishop of Corinth, if I remember right, who basically said the same thing. Christians are going out, they're treating the sick. As he puts it, they're taking on themselves the illnesses of others and dying of it in their place. I mean, he really puts almost a Christological spin on it. And I think that that's an important point because the early church was really conscious of the things that Jesus did for us. And while they knew that they couldn't accomplish redemption, that's already done through Jesus, Jesus did other things as well. He healed the sick. So the Christians, in imitation of Christ, believed it was their responsibility to go out and take care of the sick. He tells them to, that the first will be last and the last will be first. These people who are suffering, the poor, the indigent, all of these people are people that are made in the image of God. And so we need to do what we can to take care of them. Net result, Christians had the example of Jesus, the inspiration of Jesus, the teaching of Jesus, and the assurance of eternal life. And when you put those things together, you have a very, very powerful witness that comes as believers live this out, deal with the sick, try to relieve suffering, and so on. And Rodney Stark points out that even though the Christians couldn't cure these diseases per se, what they could do was provide, call it basic nursing care. And Stark's point was that even with just basic nursing care, the survival rate goes up dramatically. If you're left completely abandoned, not anybody doing anything to take care of you, you will die. But with basic nursing care, a fair number of people can actually survive these kinds of things. And that's what the Christians were doing. Now, they were doing it at the risk of their own lives. Dionysius notes that many Christians are dying while they're doing this, but they're going to their deaths happy because they know something better awaits them.
Yeah, that kind of challenges the initial assumption you'd have, which would be that the Christian strategy of running into the plague and helping the sick is suicidal. At least that's have been what the pagan neighbors are thinking when they're watching Christians go into sick beds and, help nurture people back to health or try to nurture people back to health. They're going to catch the contagion, right? But Stark's argument is very interesting because he's saying it's very possible that Christians reduced the total death toll because so many people were simply dying from lack of basic nursing that could have gotten them through the disease.
Right. Yeah, and along with that, what we do note is that, Galen doesn't really know what to make of Jews or Christians. There are just too many things that don't make sense to him as a Roman, but you can tell he's intrigued by them. What you do see, though, is that the fact that Christians are doing things like this, that they're reaching out, they're taking care of the sick, they're going to their deaths, whether by direct martyrdom or indirect martyrdom by exposing themselves to illness, they're going to their deaths happy and, rejoicing in all of this. And this is something that the pagan world doesn't understand because there is nothing in the pagan world that they would lay down their lives for the way Christians did. And the net result is this, I think, inevitably raises questions like, why are they doing this? What do they have that I don't? How can they be so confident in the face of death? I'm going to die sometime. I really wish I could go to my death as content as these guys are doing it. These kinds of questions, I think, inevitably come up with the net result that the combination of the loving care that they're extending to others, and not just the sick, but in other periods, they're feeding the poor, pagan poor as well as Christian poor. They're doing all of these kinds of works of mercy, and this attracts people to them, along with their undeniable courage in the face of death and their confidence in what follows it.
I hope you're enjoying my interview with Dr. Glen Sunshine on Christians and the Plague. 4 times a year, the Colson Center holds short courses on various topics with outstanding presenters. Our next short course, entitled Responding to Culture's Brokenness, will kick off on March 31st with Ed Stetzer on the topic of how Christians can love their neighbors during the coronavirus. The short course will continue on Tuesday evenings in April and will tackle such issues as addiction, mental health, end-of-life care, and the breakdown of the family. Each short course is recorded, so if you can't make it on a particular Tuesday, we'll send you a link to the presentation. Come to BreakPoint.org for more information and to register. Now back to Glen Sunshine. Tom Holland draws attention to an interesting theological contrast or a sort of revolution that Christianity introduced in thinking about natural catastrophes and illness. And he says that in the pagan mindset, when you see a plague break out and you see people dying from it, you automatically assume, well, they're under judgment from the gods. These are supernatural forces that have conspired against them to, for whatever reason, the gods are offended and they're taking people out. Christianity, all the way back in its roots in Judaism with things like Job, countenances the possibility of innocent suffering, that there are people whom God is not actually punishing, but who suffer nonetheless because of, the activity of Satan or the fall or whatever. And that introduces the possibility then of going in and helping these people and exercising mercy. And of course, that's typified ultimately by Christ, where he comes in and starts healing the sick and giving sight to the blind and helping the lame walk and all of this, as a foretaste of the resurrection, but also as an announcement of God's intention to raise up the lowly, to heal the sick, that he's not out there like a Zeus striking them down with thunderbolts. He loves them, and this plague is not automatically, an instance of judgment. We can't make that call. And so Christians have this different idea. How fully do you think that, or how greatly do you think that figured into their being able to turn this corner, to go help people that everyone else was running away from?
I think that it's critical. The fact is that one way to look at this is to note that what Jesus did is he came to undo the effects of the fall. He came to fix everything that's broken in the world. And whenever Jesus encountered something that was broken, he fixed it. And the Christians saw this as their responsibility as well. They were the hands and feet of Christ. They were, in fact, an army of little Jesuses traveling around the world or living their lives and doing what Jesus would do. Now, obviously, they don't have the same kind of power he does. They don't have the ability to heal at will, those kinds of things. But what they could do, they did do. Paul talks about how, we were in bondage to sin and Christ redeemed us from this. He redeemed us from our bondage to sin. Christians say, well, you know what? There are people who are in bondage, literally, that are slaves. If Jesus came to free us from our sin, we should be freeing these people from their chains. And so Christians would buy slaves specifically to set them free. And eventually this will lead to the abolition of slavery altogether. It's the same thing. Jesus was healing people. We are sick unto death. We are sick with a disease that is going to kill us, which is sin. Jesus dealt with that, but he also dealt with physical illnesses. We should be doing the same thing, because just like Jesus, for the joy set before him, went to the cross, we can, for the joy set before us, go take care of the sick. And if we die, we die. It doesn't matter. Because of the joy set before us, we know what comes afterwards.
And of course, that was why Christians ran into the plague, to help the victims. They weren't contemplating the ultimate fate of Christianity in the Roman Empire and what this might do in terms of evangelism, in terms of converting people to the faith. But Tyler O'Neill, in this great article at PJ Media a couple of days ago, he quotes Stark extensively, and he makes the argument that this was actually instrumental. This response to the various plagues was instrumental in Christianity's triumph over paganism, because it was so obviously superior to the pagan response. What do you make of that argument, and what role do you think the Christian response actually played in the triumph of Christianity, as Stark puts it?
Oh, I'm sure it had a lot to do with it. Again, the reason why Christianity grows, aside from the spiritual dynamics, the work of the Holy Spirit, those kinds of things, just looking at it on the level of, sort of human social interactions, the courage of Tertullian, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, the undeniable courage that they had in going to their deaths was something that shocked the Roman Empire. It shocked the Roman world, because there was nothing that the Romans would go to their deaths like that for. And the fact that they went willingly singing hymns and things like that just completely was beyond anything that the Romans could understand or could conceive of, and it attracted them. In the same way, their undeniable courage in going in to deal with people who are suffering, deal with people who are sick, and the success that they had in doing this, if Stark is right, increasing the survival rate, the fact that they are willing to extend themselves to their neighbors, to people they don't even know, to try to take care of them, to risk their lives for them, this attracts people. And there's no question in my mind that this was an important factor in leading many to consider Christianity.
So we've talked about the plagues that occurred in the early period of church history, when Roman paganism had not quite given way to Christianity yet. Let's talk for a minute about what happened later in Christendom, in the medieval context, where the Black Plague strikes numerous times, I think, at numerous instances, and various other plagues. What does the Christian response look like at that point? How do they treat these earth-shattering events where up to a third, I think, of Europe's population at any given time was coming to the disease?
Yeah, actually, given the numbers we can get from English rolls, it's closer to half than to a third. It's about 46, 48%, somewhere in that range.
I can't imagine.
Yeah, and that's in the space of 3 years over an entire continent. And the thing to remember is they knew full well that before it got to Europe, it had ravaged Asia, and it had gone through the Muslim world as well. So this was a true pandemic. And the mortality rate absolutely dwarfs what we're dealing with here. We know that plague in Europe spread primarily pneumonically rather than bubonically. It's the same disease, same bacillus causes it. but pneumonic plague infects the lungs and it can be passed directly person to person without fleas. And the other part of this is that pneumonic plague not only passes directly person to person, but without modern antibiotics, it's 95% fatal. So this was an absolutely horrendous thing that we saw there. And there are reactions that are, well, I guess we describe them as superstitious. The flagellant movements where people are convinced that this is a divine punishment. And so they're going around beating themselves to show God how sorry they are for their sins in the hope that it would ward off plague. That does happen. What's interesting, though, is those flagellant movements are never led by clergy. They're led almost inevitably by laymen. And while the church initially endorsed these temporarily, they very quickly gave up on that for a variety of reasons, which we can go into if you really want to. But what they ended up doing is really interesting. They contacted the University of Paris, the theological faculty there, because what we call science was in this period a branch of theology. And they said, what's going on with the plague? Now, the interesting thing is that although the answer they came up with looks to us superstitious and fanciful, what they said was, this is not a direct act of God. Yes, God's responsible because God's sovereign over all things that happens. He created the universe and everything else. But this is not a special direct act of God. It is the result of natural processes. And what they did is they went back to the Roman physician Galen. They looked at his medical theories, which were connected in actually to astrology. Astrology was considered wrong if you use it for fortune telling, but it's perfectly appropriate in this period to use it to understand a person's makeup for medical treatment. So they ended up going to an astrological explanation. There was a conjunction of Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars, which is a really bad combination, which caused a poisonous vapor to rise up from Earth, and that was what was causing plague. Now, the effect of this is twofold. First of all, it gives them a clue about what to do about plague. Now, it turns out it doesn't really work, but what they wanted to do is clean up public sanitation, basically get rid of stuff that smelled bad because that was bad air that could cause plague. So you actually see a huge boom in public sanitation in the wake of this. You also see people carrying around little things of flowers or herbs or something like that, so that if they pass by someone who's sick or something that smells bad, they can stick their nose in this and breathe in the, quote, sweetened air that would help ward off plague. This turns eventually into the plague doctor outfits with the big beaks, but it also turns into the corsage.
Huh.
Actually, yeah, the corsage has its origins in the Black Death, which is something to keep in mind the next time you go to a wedding.
Well, there's your piece of prom trivia. Those of you young people who are listening are getting set for prom, just remember to tell your date. This originated with the Black Plague.
Yep. Absolutely. But the thing that's curious about this is they went with a naturalistic explanation. If you look at the Muslim world, there were physicians who tried to go in this direction, but Islam in this period had moved into a very, fundamentalist type phase in which any discussion of contagion was seen as apostasy. And so there's a Muslim physician in Spain who actually gets lynched in part because he was trying to avert plague, because that meant that he was trying to thwart the will of Allah. So it's really remarkable what they do on that level. But the other thing that's worth noting here is that the mortality rate overall was, let's say, 46, 48%. It was higher among the clergy. The clergy actually died in greater numbers, percentage-wise, than the general population. And the reason is that so many of them were so serious about their duties to their parishioners that they willingly went out to comfort the dying, to give them the sacraments and things like that, with the net result is that they were exposing themselves to the disease far more than anybody else was, and thus they were dying from it more. So what you see, even in the midst of the Black Death, you see the clergy, at least, doing exactly the kinds of things that we saw with Galen's plague, with Cyprian's plague, with Justinian's plague.
And this shaped the Western consciousness a lot, right? I mean, John Stonestreet has talked recently about the art, for instance, that came out of the plague period, where it just stays with European Christendom for so long and helps shape the culture that we've come to recognize as late medieval European culture, right?
Right. Well, you can see things like the various dances of death. You can see the development of things called transi tombs. If you don't know what that is, it's TRANSI. Look it up. There are a variety of things like this that happen in the world of art, but there are also some rather interesting ways it affects other things. So, for example, in the Middle Ages, you don't see a huge emphasis on discussions of family, children, things like that. In the wake of the plague, there is much more consciousness of children as something that is important, something that is valuable, something to be cherished. The reason being that family identity was really critical to people in this period. And having heirs, having the next generation was something that was really important to them, because otherwise the family dies out and everything you've lived for so long disappears. And with the rate of mortality you get with plague, you see people like the Renaissance writer Alberti writes treatises on family in which he's discussing children in a way that was totally unprecedented prior to this. Our modern attitude toward the family is in part a product of the Black Death. I mean, it even affects things like that. Because prior to this, like I said, you don't see discussions of the family in anything like the same terms.
So let's move into how we apply all of this in our context, because so much of the Christian response in history, I mean, it's just tremendously inspiring. It's powerful. You can see how it shaped the way we look at everything. And yet it seems as if certain aspects of our modern response, informed by our medical understanding and our science, are contrary to the early Christian response. I'm thinking especially of the social distancing that a lot of governments are advising their citizens to practice while coronavirus is spreading, to reduce fatalities, especially among the elderly, reduce that transmission rate, keep the curve flattened. How do we run into the plague while also exercising prudence when it comes to not spreading this thing? I mean, how do we love our neighbors in the context of a modern pandemic?
I would say that Martin Luther's advice on this is as good as anything that I've seen. What he said is, paraphrasing and translating it into modern terms, he is going to take all the necessary precautions that the experts tell him to take. He is going to, as he put it, fumigate properly, wash your hands regularly. Do all of these kinds of things that the experts tell you to do. He said he would not go out unnecessarily because he didn't want to risk being responsible either for his own death or the death of his neighbor. Okay. But having said that, as he put it, if it's my time to die, God will know where to find me. And what that meant is he would not at the same time shirk any of his responsibilities. If his neighbor needed him, he would be there for him. If someone needed comforting, as a pastor, he needed to visit a parishioner, he would do it. So there's a balance to be reached here in that we want to take all due precaution. We want to pay close attention to the recommendations. We want to follow them as much as possible. But at the same time, we cannot lose track of our responsibility to love our neighbor. And particularly those who have responsibilities, spiritual responsibilities to care and comfort for people in your congregation, for example. You have to maintain those very seriously. Now, what I would suggest in practical terms, this could mean is if you can't meet with people in person, if that is hazardous for them or for yourself, there's still Skype. There's the phone. There are all kinds of ways that we have to keep in touch with people, to pay attention to what's going on, to talk to people, to comfort them, to reassure them, to support them without being physically present. And at the very least, we should be doing that. And that's something that's not just for pastors, that's for everybody. We should be paying attention to our neighbors. We should be paying attention to their needs. We should be watching out for them. If we need to go grocery shopping, we should pick things up for our neighbors who maybe can't go out or shouldn't go out. These kinds of things are things that anybody can do. And along with that, I would also add that for pastors and people like that, hospital visits, if permitted, are important because people matter. And ultimately, when you are in the hospital, you are alone, you are scared, you're in isolation. You need somebody there to encourage you, to lift you up, and so on. And again, subject to what the hospitals will let you do or not do. That's an area that I think hospital visitations and at-home visitations, as much as it can be done, are something that people with pastoral responsibilities need to pay attention to. That's essentially what Luther was doing, what Luther said, and I think it's very good advice.
Which passages of Scripture, Glenn, would you look to for comfort and edification in times like this, especially if you're in the situation of comforting someone who is in isolation, who is in intensive care?
First place I always turn to Psalm 46. Luther, going back to him, I'm a Reformation historian, so sooner or later I end up back with Luther. Luther wrote, "A mighty fortress is our God," as a reflection on Psalm 46. That's actually his metrical version of Psalm 46. And while the imagery comes from his time when he was hiding away in the Wartburg Castle, apparently he wrote it during a time of plague. So Psalm 46 is one that's really important to me. Psalm 90 is as well. It's one that a lot of people aren't pointing to, but I think it's very important. And in general, I would spend a lot of time in the Psalms. The majority of Psalms were written when the psalmist was in trouble one way or another. And thus, they're a good place to look for comfort, for a way of, for giving us vocabulary to express our concerns, our fears, our emotions to God.
I've been talking with Dr. Glen Sunshine, professor of history at Central Connecticut State University. Glenn, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast. It's been just a great conversation.
Thanks for having me.
All right, wonderful. Thanks, everyone, for listening to the BreakPoint Podcast. And please remember to come to breakpoint.org and register for our next short course, Responding to Culture's Brokenness. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.